Well, thank you, everyone. Um, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is maybe some things that you've heard about before, but probably not in quite the context. That yeah, there's all these nice old buildings and houses and so on around the flats, but you don't really realize it driving through there today. Back in the well, from the at least the mid 1800s up and through the mid 1900s, what a vibrant commercial area it was. Because especially early on, like if you were to go into Burlington for something, it was an all-day trip with a horse and wagon. You didn't just run down to the store and get something. So you needed all of the whatever things you might need to be available locally. And speaking of going somewhere, one of the first things, of course, you needed was some way to get around. This you probably would recognize the former Waters Library up in the flats. This is the same area a little earlier on. One of the things that you needed to get around, you had to have a wagon and horses and harnesses and all wheelwrights and all kinds of things to enable you to be able to move around. And this was a blacksmith shop, right beside the street light there. For many years, this was Samuel Bliss's blacksmith shop, opened about 1847, and he also was a carriage maker, because you had to have the carriage to go with it. And it closed in about 1930, but there were several owners between his opening it and that time. And the library was built in 1933 on the same spot. There was another blacksmith shop at what's today 441 Route 15, operated for about 38 years by a man named Hazen Colgrove. This would be up at the other end of the flats, about across from where Meadow Lane is today. And that was really a little bit more than just like your typical blacksmith shop like this. It was more, I think, today what you'd call actually a machine shop. They had power tools in there powered by a steam engine. In addition to the blacksmithing work, they also had a cider press there. So this time of year, they'd been making cider, and also did wheelwrighting work. There was another blacksmith shop over on Park Street, Pearly King. Across from the park on 15, there was a wheelwright shop in the 1850s. Now we're over on Park Street, and what we're going to talk about right now is this little building here. That was a harness shop, because if you had the horse and buggy, you needed some way to hook them together. You had to have the harness. And so that was there about 1860s and 1870s. And then later that got turned into a blacksmith shop with Will Gaines. Then, by the early 1900s, 1910 or so, automobiles started coming along. And so we're at the end of Park Street looking across onto Route 15. You can see what was the former Underhill garage here. This is the same area, so this is like Kintner Chiropractic, the same house, but these buildings over here actually burned in 1915. That was the home of Levi Metcalf, and on the right, the little building you can just see there, was Fred King's barber shop. And so that was burned in 1915, and so in 1918, that was when the garage was built. Automobiles were coming along enough to that point, so there was a business enough to require a garage. Established by Edwin Irish and Max Bogue, by the 1925, Albert and Madeline Williams operated a Chevrolet agency there, car dealership, in other words. 1927, it was purchased by Max Bogue and Elwood Clark, and in 1938 became an international dealership, and what many of you would know today is Clark's Truck Center, which moved in the 1986 down onto Route 15 near the corner of Brown's Trace. This is up at the other end of the flats. This was a Texaco station owned originated by Fred Seymour in 1949. By the late 1960s, Paul Ward ran it for a while, and Alan Bolio, and lastly Ted and Jeff Alexander. But of course, even with the difficulty in traveling compared to today, people still did travel. And so, of course, you needed somewhere to stay. I mean, you think, how far can you go in a day with a horse and wagon? If you're traveling any distance, it was over a course of several days, and so you had to have somewhere to stop. So one of the places would have been, well, I'm getting a little ahead of my story here. One of the earliest places around the flats was actually a building on the corner of Route 15 and the Raceway, across from where Jericho Market is today. It's on the northwest corner, just kind of a nondescript apartments, doesn't look like much. But that was actually a hotel known as the Bass House, and probably dates to either the early 1800s or possibly the very late 1700s. So for what it looks like today, there's a lot more history there than you might think. This is down a little further on the other end of the flats in the Riverside area, at 351 Route 15. And this was what was in that spot. This was known as the Bostwick House. Arthur Bostwick built this about 1802, and as time went on, in 1843, his daughter Sally married Rufus Brown, and they took over operation of the hotel. And travelers had the option of traveling with a stagecoach. Somewhere before 1827, there was a Mr. Burroughs that drove a stage from Essex up through Underhill to Johnson. And by 1829, Roswell Butler from Essex was driving the nice yellow Concord coaches. They're drawn by 4 horses, went up as far as Stansted, Quebec. And in wintertime, covered sleighs replaced the wheeled coaches. By the 1860s, stages were running twice a day from Essex to the halfway house up on Mount Mansfield, stopping at the Bostwick House on the way for meals.
Gary, sorry about it. Could you sort of make it more clear where was the Bostwick House specifically?
Can you back up 2 slides? Right there, yeah. Which is basically on the west side of Route 15 across from Dickinson Street.
Oh, okay.
One more. In 1866, the Bostwick House was bought by Leonard Dixon, and so quickly became the Dixon House. And as you can see from this picture compared to the earlier ones, one of the things he quickly did was expand it. More rooms and so forth, but also they added on things like a dance hall. And luckily, when the railroad came through Underhill in 1877, just the way things happened to work out, it went right almost beside the Dixon House. So the railroad made a platform there where people could get on and off the trains right there at the hotel. And so they actually would run trains up from people who would come up from Burlington to come to the dances here. And one of the interesting things, remember, early 1880s, I think it was, when Mr. Dixon died. And the B&L actually ran a special train from Burlington, so all the people that had been up there coming for dances and so forth could come up to attend his funeral. This photo here, I should have got a newer one. This is actually a little historic in itself. I'm sure most of you know where Poorhouse Pies is, up at the other end of the flats. It had been the Flower Shop Bakery in about 2003, Countryside Florist in 1985, and so forth. But it started out as the Underhill Post Office. And this is a picture of when it was dedicated in November 1960. But if we go back a little further, this is what was on that same spot. This was the Custer House, established about 1887 by a man named Thaddeus Whipple, who had previously run the American House in Cambridge. And while he was in Cambridge, he also was a gun maker. And I know there's a couple of museums around that actually have some of his firearms in their collections. There's no record that he ever made any once he'd come to Underhill. And in 1898, he sold out to Ira Lincoln, who had worked for him at the hotel. And while Ira owned it, in 1914, it burned. And the lot from that time sat empty until 1960 when they built the post office there. So as a kid, it was just an empty lot. But you didn't realize the history that had been behind it. This is another one, which of course is still around, the Hotel Sinclair. That was built in 1893 by a man named Ed Sinclair, who was a local builder. And the story always went that he built this with all of the different turrets and the windows and everything, so that when people came and wanted him to build them a house, he could point out all of the different things that he was capable of doing. So it was kind of like a showpiece for his contracting business. And he and his wife Ruth ran this as a hotel, at least seasonally, up through 1933. And then we have the Fairview House. This is over on River Road, right at the corner of Park Street. And the house itself hasn't changed too awful much. That's still there. The barn, unfortunately, has been changed, a different barn. That was established by Frank Jackson about 1900, but Thomas and Carrie Bruce bought it about 1905 and operated it for a number of years. And one of the things that was popular at that time for people, tourists to come, could come in on the train from somewhere, or even, for out-of-staters, and stay in some local place and maybe go hiking up on the mountain for a day or two and so on. And so this was a popular stop for that sort of activities. Now we have the building that's over on Park Street, right at the back side of the park, which is like the Bass House, looks pretty nondescript, but it has a lot more history to it than you might think. This was the Tower and Oaks store. And John Tower and Henry Oaks had a store over on Route 15 on the west side of the park. And that burned, and so to rebuild, they rebuilt this building on the back side of the park in the mid to late 1830s. And John Towers was known as Judge Tower, as he was a side judge. He also was the town clerk, town representative, and both he and Henry Oaks were postmasters at one time or another, so the post office was in the store as well. And one of the interesting stories about Towers, he was involved in the temperance movement, had gone to a meeting over in Jericho Center, temperance meeting, and he was so enthused by that when he came home from the meeting, he went down in the basement where he had several barrels of hard cider and liquor and so forth, dumped them all on the floor and swore that he'd never sell another drop of anything like that. And apparently never did. And by the mid-1850s, this was what was known as a union store, the NEPU, Division 137, the New England Protective Union, and they had a whole chain of these stores all over. I know there was one in Jericho Corners and one in Jericho Center, and they were, kind of like you think in the 1950s and 60s, what an IGA store. I mean, they were all over. In 1857, this was sold to Lewis Carlton, and that's the era that this picture dates from. And around that time, it got to be known as the White Store. From 1898 to 1907, it was operated by H.A. Barrows and Company as a clothing store. And that was one of the things that, again, you wanted, clothes of some sort. You weren't going to, go off to Walmart or somewhere. You had to have something reasonably close by. And besides a store like this, there were a couple of tailors around Underhill Flats. Charlie Reynolds, who we'll talk maybe a little bit more about a little later. And there was another man named W.I. Assam that in 1897 bought the former District 3 schoolhouse, which was up on the other end of the flats up near Poker Hill Road. and converted that to a tailor shop. Meanwhile, for the women, there was a lot more activity there. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, probably about 10 or 12 millinery shops around the flats. One of them was Mrs. C.C. Abbott, and she and her husband kind of ran this jointly. She ran more the millinery shop. He was a traveling salesman, also selling similar sorts of clothing and so forth. And it was their son. He was Carlos Abbott. His son was Clinton Abbott, but they're both C.C., so it gets confusing there. His C.C. Jr. was the Burlington and Lamoille station agent in Underhill, and he'll show up here a little later as well. There was a Hattie Corse who had a shop just a little bit north of the park and on the west side of Route 15, and she would, like, once or twice a year, she'd make a trip to New York City and buy up all of the latest fashions and bring back so that the local ladies had the latest fashions available to them right here in the flats. Now this store ended up being sold, of course, a number of times over the years. By 1927, it was Mason and Foster, Charlie Mason and Grace Foster. And in 1929, Frank Simpson bought out Charlie Mason, so it became Foster and Simpson. And by 1934, Simpson had taken it over solely, and that was the time period this picture was taken. This is an interior view of the store, again, with Charlie Mason and Grace Foster. And on the side of the store, again, was the Underhill Post Office. That was where the post office was until 1960, when the new one just up the road that we just saw was opened. The only thing I remember about going in here, once you got inside the door, it just seemed like it was awfully dark and dingy in there. The new post office was a total change. This is the brick store over on the north corner of the park on 15. And again, that went through a whole lot of hands over the years. It was built in 1856 by George Simmons on the site of Colonel Frederick Fletcher's nice brick house. It just always amazed me that you tore down a nice brick house in the middle of the 1800s. But that's what you did to build a store. Many different people ran it through the years. L.F. Terrell and his son George were in there from 1883 to 1898, and it was a true general store. They sold groceries and dry goods, meal, feed, bran, middlings, newspapers, magazines, sewing machines, silverware, jewelry, house flour from down at Chittenden Mills in Jericho. They bought and sold butter. The post office was in there for a time. When the first telephone system came to the flats, the switchboard was in the store for a while. So about as general a store as you could get. From 1911 to 1916, it was operated by C.N. Steigels, who had previously been in a store over on Park Street that we'll see in a couple minutes. One of the things that may be a little hard to see in this picture, but right there is an interesting sign. It says, filtered gasoline. You think, I mean, in 1911, if you had a car, you know, there weren't filling stations around like there are today, and typically the first places that sold gasoline were hardware stores. And then as time went, or drugstores, and as time went on, you know, filling stations started coming around. And C.N. Steigels also sold automobiles, in particular, what's called the Orient buckboard. And it really was four wheels with a few boards between them and a little tiny engine on the back. So it didn't look like much, but it got around better than a horse, I guess. Now we're back looking down Park Street. And by 1907 to 1927 was owned by L.C. Fowler. And if you, so this was his store, but if you see right there, there's a little building there. We'll talk more about, you'll see a better picture of that in a minute. That was L.C. Fowler's warehouse. That was over beside the railroad tracks, which we'll talk a little more about the railroad as well. And so he could either ship out or get incoming goods in his warehouse and then bring them over to the store as needed. And he was running the brick store as well at the same time. So he's got the groceries and so forth in the brick store, dry goods in the other store, and then the warehouse down on Park Street. And there's the warehouse. And the railroad tracks are going kind of across here right in front of the warehouse. Okay. Now, this is kind of a zoomed in version of a bird's eye view of the flats. And this building right here is what today you would know as Jacob's store. You see the locomotive here, the train just going across the Park Street. And you've got some other buildings in here. And the store itself was built in 1887 by a man named Homer Thompson. And he was quite the entrepreneur in the flats. He built the store. He also built a mill. He had a blacksmith shop, ran a tin shop. I was figuring a lot of things. So when he first built this store, besides selling groceries, he had sold farm supplies, including wagons and machinery. And on the second floor was what was known as Thompson's Hall. This was an assembly hall where things like what we're doing here tonight would have happened. Sometimes they'd be at some kind of a traveling show. Different organizations might hold a meeting there and so forth and so on. So it was a little bit of, anybody that needed a place to have a get-together. That lasted up until 1892. By that time, the GAR Hall, which we'll talk about a little more, had been built, and so they were using that more for the assemblies, and so the upper floor of the store was converted to living quarters for the storekeeper. And just west of the store, which I'm guessing is this building here, he built a tin shop, made tinware and hardware. One of the big things was every spring he had a machine that would make syrup cans and sap buckets, and made as many as 2,500 sap buckets each spring. He died in April of 1895. His estate operated the store for another 4 years, but by 1902, it was operated by C.N. Steigels. And you can see the sign on the top here. And you notice the one-story porch here. But while Steigels was operating it, he built on a porch on the second floor. So that's where that came to be. And then eventually he sold out in 1911, moved over to the brick store. And so then it became Brown and Nay for a time. And then Clayton and his son Parker Rice ran it, Isidore Myers and Hector Marcoux. And then in 1948, Tippy and Minnie Jacobs bought the store. This is Wesley and Genevieve, but nobody knew them by those names. They were always Tippy and Minnie. And they bought the store, and I say, in 1948, and it's still their descendants that are running it to this day.
Is that Tippy and Minnie right there?
That is. That's Tippy and Minnie. Probably a couple of the kids, but I don't know who those are. This is, again, the same store, and this building over here is what's known as the Gallup Block. Various buildings here, and this building here was the home of Ernest Goodwin. And say we think this was the tin shop that Thompson had, and then this is 5 years later. You can still see Goodwin's house here, but this building is gone, and here's a different building here. And the other interesting thing is this house here with the flat roof, that's where Miltons live today. And so now this is back looking at the same view we had a couple slides ago. So you're still looking at the Jacob's store. Here's the L.C. Fowler's warehouse. This is the Underhill mill, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Back to Ernest Goodwin's house. And this was E.J. Gallup's tin shop. And this is the same spot after the Goodwin's house was replaced with the Gallup block. And you still see the tin shop building hiding in the background. And again, this is the other view of it. And you can see it again, Milton's house here with a flat roof. And here's Milton's house again after the peaked roof is put on like it is today. And this is E.J. Gallup and his wife Annie. No, back up, we're not done. This is their son David Gallup. And the interesting thing here, you have a gas pump. So that was one of the first real gas pumps, real filling stations in Underhill. And they would bring gasoline in a tanker on a tank on the back of a wagon, horse-drawn, and fill a tank there. And then they could, typically you'd pump, this pump looks a little different. Most of these, you had a glass globe on the top. You'd pump the gasoline up in and measure it, and then it would just drop by gravity into your car. Dave Gallup here, I say he carried on the tinware business that his father had started. But you get into by the even the 1950s and especially 1960s, the bigger hardware stores were coming along. Of course, people, you had paved roads and modern automobiles and so forth, so you could, run down to Essex if you needed hardware and so forth. And so the business at his hardware store was kind of getting slim. And so David went back to his talents as a tinsmith and started making copper dippers and copper lamps. And those found a big market for a number of years. He had a big business making those. So now we're looking back the other way. Again, this is what's today Jacob's store. This is when Parker Rice ran it. And this was a nationwide store. And that was, again, another chain like IGA that is long gone now, but those were common around most little villages. And this is, by this time, Foster's Mill. And here's a good picture of the mill itself. This was also built by Homer Thompson, this in 1893. And this picture is taken probably in the early 1940s. So it's just after the railroad had gone out of business in 1938. But the railroad would have gone right through here. And so there's actually a siding right beside the mill where the railroad cars could be set off and the grain dumped down through these openings in the foundation into the mill. So it's easy to unload the cars there. And that was, of course, most mills you think of were probably water powered, but no water power here in the flats. And so this was operated by a gas engine. And the gas, you think of gasoline. Well, no, this was gas made by what was called a producing plant from soft coal. So they made this gas from the soft coal, which then powered the gas engine. From about 1900 to 1911, operated by L.H. Pendleton, and from 1911 through 1938 by Jasper Foster. It was his sister, Grace Foster, that owned the Foster and Simpson store over on the corner. And he lived in this house. You can see through the trees here. After 1938, the mill was bought by E.W. Bailey Company from Montpelier. And at that time, they were going around the countryside buying up all of the small mills and either taking over the operation of them or closing them down, basically to eliminate their competition. So at the same time they bought this mill, they bought the Waterbury Feed Company mill in Waterbury, they bought Chittenden Mills in Jericho and so forth. All of them ran for a little while. This one was operated until 1946. No, until 1950. Jasper Foster continued operating it until 46, and then it was ran by Ken Buxton until 1950 when it was finally closed, and it was taken down in 1952. This is back over on Route 15, just about across from the park, maybe one house south of there. This was the home of Dr. Arthur Burdick, and he was born in Underhill in 1828, had apprenticed for 3 years with Luther Macumber as a carpenter, and once he'd learned the trade in 1849, went to California during the gold rush, but he made his money by building buildings and equipment for the miners, instead of prospecting. Returned to Underhill in 1852, and then went to UVM Medical School and became a doctor, graduated in 1858. Opened a practice in Underhill, but in 1859 went back to school in New York City for a year, and then come back to Underhill and resumed his medical practice here in the Flats. Started out in a section of his house, but as time went on, he also operated a drugstore in the house. But about 1870, he moved across the street and opened the drugstore in this building. I imagine a lot of you know where Green Thumb Hydroponics was until just recently. That building was, before it became a hydroponic store, was the Methodist Church. And this building right here, you can just see the edge of, was the former Methodist Church. So this building would have been right next to it. About 1871, W. Scott Ney began studying medicine with Dr. Burdick. And it was typical of education, the way doctors were educated in those days, that you'd study with a doctor for a time, and then you'd go to medical school, and then maybe come back and apprentice with a doctor again for a while. So you had some practical training along with their college education. Dr. Ney graduated from UVM College of Medicine in 1873, and came back to Underhill and went into a joint practice with Dr. Burdick, and also about that time took over operation of the drugstore. Sadly, at about 11 a.m. on August 11th, 1906, in a house just to the left out of this picture, an oil stove exploded and caught the house afire, and in the home of Dr. Walter Grace. And the fire spread next door to Dr. Ney's house, then next door to the drugstore, then next door to the Methodist Church. That had a slate roof on it, so they thought that that was going to probably save it. Well, it didn't. And it spread from there next door to the Grange Hall. And you can see over in the background, this is what's today the United Church, or was the Congregational Church at that time. They said that building caught fire once or twice, and the store here, the White store also, but they were able to put those out. You can see this house here, the wet blankets they put on the roof to keep the sparks from setting that afire. But they still, and so once they got the sense that this was going to be a pretty serious fire, they sent word to Burlington. And Burlington Fire Department loaded a fire engine on a flat car and sent it up on the railroad. They made it from Burlington to Underhill in 35 minutes. And one of the things that was in the upper floor of the drugstore was the Masonic Hall. That had been originated in Essex, and in the late 1880s or 1890s, they had moved to Jericho, and their Masonic Hall was in the upper floor of the Pierce block. That burned in 1901. So after that got burned out there, they moved to Dr. Ney's drugstore, had their meeting hall in the upstairs of the drugstore. 5 years later, they get burned out a second time. But Dr. Ney soon rebuilt the drugstore, and the Masonic headquarters were in the upper floor of the drugstore. And the Methodists soon built the new church, the building that's there now. And you can just see through the trees here, there's a little building right there. That had been the former Congregational Chapel. And in the 1880s, the Congregationalists built the church parlors on the back of their church, and so they no longer needed that building. And so it was sold and used by, I know Amos Humphrey had his cobbler shop in there for a time, and I think the library was in there for a short time, and just a variety of different things. Maybe it seems like the post office was there as well. Anyway, there's a picture I should have put in here, and maybe I didn't. But so let me back up one if you could. Right on this little corner right here, after the new congregational church was built, they moved that building over, and it's still today. It's right there on that corner beside there, and that was the parish hall for the Methodists. And then once Green Thumb took it over, it became their office. And between that and the corner, there was room enough there for two buildings. There also was a little building there that was the first actual fire station that the Underhill Fire Department had. Okay, now we're over on Park Street in front of Jacobs looking back toward Route 15. And this building on the right here is what's known as the Neely Block. This is what it would have looked like shortly after it was built. Elbridge Neely had been operating a jewelry store over in Jericho Center since 1892. And 1908, he came to Underhill and built this building. And the little building right beside it was a barber shop. There's a close-up of the barber shop. Frank Ledoux on the left was the barber, and Mike McMahon is on the right. In 1915, they rebuilt the Neely Block, so this building was incorporated into it, so it all became just one long building. And then later on, there's actually a second story that was added onto it, and so it looked as it does today. And meanwhile, Elbridge Neely expanded his business to add sporting goods, antiques, new and used furniture. That operated up till about 1930. By the early 1920s, Charles Scribner used part of the store for his business, dealing in electrical supplies, fixtures, and appliances. And the two of them jointly operated an insurance business as well. And everything had closed up by the mid-1930s, and the building housed a variety store for a time, which other than knowing what I just told you, I've known nothing more about that, what it was, or who operated it or anything. By the 1950s, a man named Wiley Danforth operated an antique store in there for a time. And by the early 1960s, it was converted to apartments, which it has been ever since. Now we're down on Dickinson Street, so we're on this left side would be where Jericho Market is today. And you're looking out toward River Road and on toward Underhill Center. You see a little bit of the mountain there in the background. And you see the little sign right here. That was the sign to warn people because the railroad tracks went right across here. And what that says is look out for the engine. So on the left is the steam mill. That was a steam-powered sawmill. Again, no water power in Underhill, so everything was steam-powered or gas-powered. That was built in 1876 by Gilbert and Robinson. And the 1875, they had started building the B&L Railroad. That started in Jericho, and they built both directions, so toward Cambridge Junction and toward Burlington, both at the same time. So by the time this was built in 1876, the railroad hadn't quite got there, but they knew it was coming and they knew where it was going to go, and so the sawmill was built right beside the railroad tracks. That burned August 5th, 1893. Darius Knight and George Terrell rebuilt it, back in operation by February of 1894. This was a time when they were logging off the side of Mount Mansfield, and so that was where most of the wood was coming from. There'd be as many as 40 loads of logs a day coming into the mill. September 1894, the mill burned for a second time. But it was rebuilt and rerunning again by the end of October that year. And by 1897, Darius Knight was running it on his own. And this is looking from kind of, in back of Jacob's store, somewhere in that area, looking back. So here's the steam mill, and you can see these houses along here are along on Route 15. So those houses are still there. You can also see the railroad car sitting here because the tracks were coming right through here. And as the note on the photo says, 3 acres of logs. So this is where the logs were coming in from Mount Mansfield and being piled up there at the mill, and you see the sawn lumber that was piled up there as well. They were, by this time, there was about 2 million feet of logs in the mill yard. And then in 1910, the mill was purchased by a man named Harmon Howard, and April 4th, 1912, he was working in the mill, and his foot was crushed between a log and the saw carriage and had to be amputated. That was on April 4th. May 20th, the mill burned again for the 3rd time. But again, it was rebuilt. And as you can see here, you can see the railroad flat car right there in the middle of the mill yard, and they're loading the lumber onto it. So this made a very easy way. They could get all of the logs off from the side of Mount Mansfield, saw them here, ship them out on the railroad to wherever they needed to go to from there. And this was, at that time, one of the biggest sawmills in northern Vermont. A lot of different people had their finger in it, one of which was Urban Woodbury, who had been governor of Vermont at one time and was involved in one of the lumber companies in Burlington who had an interest in this mill. And of course, he also was the one that one of the things I didn't put in my notes, operated the hotel that was on the corner of St. Paul and Main Street in Burlington that burned in 1951. This was a little later on, one of the ways that logs got to the mill. This is George White sitting on the right on the top of the logs. That's parked in front of the brick store there in the flats. And in the wintertime, when they're bringing most of these logs to the mill, when the snow on the ground and easier sledding, the teams were coming from as far away as Burlington to help drawing the logs. They also could produce steam-bent chair wood, fork handles, novelty turning, shingles, clapboards, made cheese boxes and butter tubs, at times employing from 50 to 100 men. By the 1920s, the mill was sold to Buell Irish and Lynn Moulton, later to Alson Sweeneyer and his son-in-law Howard Stufflebeam, and closed in the late 1930s. And in 1960, Richard Villeneuve, who had operated a sawmill up on Kruglet Road in Underhill Center, moved down to the same site and built a new sawmill in the same spot as the steam mill. And in 1967, built another new mill, which sawed logs, instead of the normal circular saw, sawed logs using a bandsaw, which was a pretty novel thing at the time. So now we're back in the side yard of Dr. Burdick's house, looking across the park. So there's the park. You barely see the brick store in the corner here through the trees. You can see the spire, anyway, of the Congregational Church. And this building on the side here is what was the Grange Hall that had been built originally as a store, and by J.B. Wilbur. It was called the Underhill Cash Store. And in the basement of it, there was a couple, Whipple and Burroughs, that operated a meat market. This was the picture I was looking for earlier. I had it in a different place. So after the fire in 1906, they rebuilt the Methodist Church, moved the former Congregational Chapel over and used that as the Methodist Parish Hall. And here's the first Underhill Fire Station. Before that, the Underhill Jericho Fire Department, which really started out as Underhill, because it started out in 1913 as nothing more than a chemical tank on 2 wheels. And what's now the United Church of Underhill Parsonage on Park Street, that was a farm, even though it's right in the village, and there was a big cow barn there, and there was a little shed on the end of that cow barn where they kept this little cart with the chemical tank. And so anytime there was a fire around the village, a couple of men would grab a hold of this cart and just wheel it to wherever the fire was. So if you had a fire in Jericho or somewhere, it was of no use. I mean, you couldn't get it there. But eventually, late teens, they bought a Model T truck and outfitted that as a fire truck. And we were looking a few minutes ago at the Neely block. There was a garage door in the middle of the Neely block, and they kept the fire truck in there for a time. But by the 1930s, Elbridge Neely needed the space in his store for other things, and so that's when the fire department built this building here. And after the new fire station was built up on Route 15 in 1952, they moved out of this building, so this was just sitting there. So this building was actually moved over across the street and just used as a house, as a garage, until literally this last summer when it was disassembled, and the fire department has got it under storage now, and they're hoping to reassemble it as a historic site. This is the house over on 6 Park Street. So if you coming up 15 from Jericho and cut around the corner, this is the first house you come to. It was formerly the Mansfield Theater. There's a man named Judson Santamore that had moved here from Stowe, worked at the creamery down in Riverside, and ended up marrying Mrs. Julia Farrell, who lived in this house. And after they were married, he convinced her in the early 1920s to build a dance hall. Well, this is during Prohibition. I mean, dance halls weren't that much in fashion. And so that didn't last very long, and they changed it over to a movie theater. And this became the Mansfield Theater, and would seat about 200 people. And when talkies came along, they converted over so they could use project talkies. They had a piano in there during the silent movies, so somebody had an accompaniment on the piano. And so this is the next house up the street. This was, you spoke earlier about Pearlie King had a blacksmith shop on Park Street. Well, this was his house. This was in the back of it. And Alice was his wife, and she was the switchboard operator. And the switchboard, back in the early days, moved around several places. So it started out over in the brick store, and then it was in Dr. Nay's drugstore for a while, and then it moved over into Mrs. Farrell's house that we just saw there a moment ago, where the movie theater was. And while it was still in the Dr. Nay's drugstore, Alice King started working for the telephone company as an operator in 1914. And so when it moved over to Mrs. Farrell's house, Alice King moved along with the switchboard. And after Mrs. Farrell died, she and the switchboard moved back to her own home next door. And so she was the telephone operator, and the switchboard was there in her house. And you can see the sign out in front of the house for the telephone company. That was up until the dial system came along in 1955. That's when the switchboard finally went away. So as I mentioned, the B&L Railroad started construction in 1875, and it was finally completed from Burlington to Cambridge Junction in 1877. And so this was the Underhill station, and that building right there was the car house where they stored the hand car when the section crews weren't using it to maintain the tracks. And that building actually still exists. It's on a farm over in Jericho. It was used as a tool shed after the railroad closed. But of course, once the railroad came through, this changed things both in the regard of all the different things now that could be shipped into Underhill that weren't practical to do beforehand, but also the things from Underhill that now could be shipped out. So there were things like lumber, maple sugar. In 1899, there was one 3-week period they shipped 30 tons of maple sugar. 1886, they shipped 60,000 pounds of butter. November 1896, 1 week, they shipped 5 tons of poultry. And out of the picture, but over on the other side of the tracks here, there was a stockyard and scales so they could weigh the produce of any sort that was being shipped. Another big item that was shipped on the B&L was potatoes. Underhill was a very big potato growing area. 1886, they shipped 15,000 bushels of potatoes. 1890, George Terrell shipped 100 carloads of potatoes. 1893, 3,140 bushels were loaded in 2 days, and there were 23 teams lined up waiting to unload their potatoes into the railroad cars. But by the 1930s, trucks were taking over business, and between the trucks taking away the freight shipping and the Vermont Transit buses were running up through here by then and taking away the passenger business. And so this is Effie's Lunch and Bus Terminal, which you can see this is Underhill Garage. That building is still there. Right next to it is just kind of an empty parking lot today. That's where Effie's was. And you remember across the road, the brick store was run by the Terrells. Well, Effie was a daughter of one of the Terrells. She was Effie Terrells. She married Charlie Reynolds, and by the 1920s, she was running the Underhill Millinery Parlors in here, one of the millinery shops for the ladies. Her husband, Charlie, was a tailor, and so in the back of the house, he had his tailor shop. And in addition to that, across the road in the house that's next to the brick store, at that time was where the post office was located. And so one of Charlie's jobs was to have a little hand truck that he'd go over and meet the train, drop off the mail from the post office, and pick up whatever came in on the train to bring back over to the post office. And as the buses took over more, this also, Effie had a little bit of a lunchroom here. That expanded, and also this became the bus terminal for Underhill. And after 1954, Effie died, and Elwood Clark, who was running Underhill Garage at that point, bought her house, tore it down, and used that spot, as you see it today, for a parking lot, because by that time his truck dealership had expanded to the point where all up and down Route 15 there were trucks parked beside the road. There was just no other room to park them. And so he made a parking lot where he had a place to get his vehicles off the road. And beside the businesses themselves, there were several fraternal organizations in Underhill. One of the more prominent ones was the GAR. And that had been formed in 1883, the post in Underhill, L.H. Bostwick, post number 69. And they met in the Academy building. What, if you remember it at all today, you might remember is where the building up and a little further up the road in the flats where the Green Mountain Foam was located for years. That had previously been the Underhill High School, well, Underhill ID School, the Underhill High School, the Underhill Academy, and so on and so forth, back into the mid-1800s. And at one point in the 1880s, there was some room in there that wasn't otherwise being used, and so the GAR held their meetings there. But they wanted a building of their own. They were kind of sick of meeting in just some little building somewhere. And so in 1889, they finally had a piece of land donated to them at the end of what today you know as GAR Place. And in, I believe it was in June of 1889, they started building the building, and by October it was completed, and they had the dedication ceremony there. And that became a meeting place not just for the GAR, but for all kinds of, other social organizations around town and traveling shows, and what have you, besides just the GAR, and that is what I say took over from Thompson's Hall. And on the first floor there was a dining room. On the second floor was a large auditorium. This is a picture of the second floor not too long after it was built. And because after a few years they remodeled, and across the front of here they actually built a stage, and that was what was there for the rest of its time. And where you see a window here, they converted that into a door, and that became a fire escape. And as the years went by and the veterans were passing on, there just weren't enough left to carry it on. In 1904, operation of the hall moved over to the Women's Relief Corps, which was the Women's Auxiliary of the GAR. Well, by 1937, even the Women's Relief Corps, was having a hard time operating the building, and so the towns of Jericho and Underhill jointly bought the building. 1942, they turned around and sold it to the Underhill ID School District, and it was used for both the grade school and the high school graduations, as well as all kinds of other public gatherings. And I remember going to a Halloween party there. That was in the downstairs, and the only thing I really remember about it seemed like it was very dark and dingy in there, not well lit at night. And up on the upper floor, when I was in about 1955, there's a lady named Doris Ward, the Ward family had a local band, and she got together a group of us first graders and taught us how to square dance, and we put on a performance there in the GAR hall. The thing I particularly remember about that is, say, by that time the stage was here, and they would put like a cardboard wall around the center part of the stage, so you had like a backstage area, and between this wall of the building and the back wall of this stage area, there was just about room enough to walk through there, and it was on the wicked hot summer night, and standing in that little space waiting to come out on stage. And finally closed for good in 1958 and was sold to the Clark family, and then in 2009 to the Carter family. And they had moved it onto a new foundation and were in the process of restoring the building, when sadly it was destroyed by a fire in November of 2010. A lot of memories went with that. These are some ribbons from some of the organizations around town. This one here is from the Bostwick Post of the GAR. This one is the Mount Mansfield Lodge of the IOGT, the International Order of Good Templars. And the farther one is the Lodge 120 and 170 of the Mount Mansfield Grange. No, that was the Templars are 120 and the Mansfield Grange is 170. This is the store we mentioned a little bit earlier there that had been built by Jim Wilbur in 1892. It was operated by the Payne brothers for a little while, by Wilbur for a little while, a lot of kind of clothing as a clothing store and so forth. But by 1898, it had become the Grange Hall. And that was one of the buildings that was destroyed in the big fire in August of 1906. And so at that point, the Grange moved over to the former Congregational Chapel, and they disbanded in 1908. And so apparently that's when that building was moved over and became the Methodist Parish Hall. And now, if you can see right in the very edge of the picture, that is the edge of what today you know as the United Church of Underhill. The building you're looking at here is what today you'd know as the United Church's Clutter Barn. That was actually started out life as the Knights of Pythias Hall. And the Minerva Lodge 21 of the Knights of Pythias was organized in Jericho in 1898. And after the chapel building was moved from this site over to beside the Methodist Church in 1908, the Knights of Pythias bought the lot, and in 1915 they built this building. That was their meeting hall. And there was another group of Grange people, Grange number 524. It was organized in 1935, and they shared the use of this building with the Knights of Pythias. And the Minerva Lodge of the Knights of Pythias and the Mizpah Temple number 14 of the Pythian Sisters. And the Grange finally bought the building in 1942, or 1937. In 1942, the building was bought by Harold Brown, and he ran a funeral home in Richmond, and this became a branch of his funeral home. He had another branch also over in Heinsberg. And in 1969, he retired, sold the building to his assistant, George Gifford. He in turn retired from the funeral business in 1998, and that's when the United Church bought the building and converted it into their clutter barn. And this is a bird's eye view of the flats. So you see the grist mill, the Thompson's later Jacob's store, the Methodist church that burned. You just barely see the Congregational church, the railroad station. And that's pretty much it. I believe we're going to have a word about the Underhill Historical Society website and what can be done with that. And then after that, if there's questions, we'll go from there.
Okay. Eli, Dunderand has created a Historical Society website, and there's a link off this website that takes you to an interactive map of, you'll see in a minute, many of the buildings that you just saw in the flats, as well as the 15 original schoolhouses in town. To get there, you would go to the Historical Society website, and then go to Underhill History, right here, and then to Maps. Actually, you're in a different place, but that's okay. And this interactive map, coming, maybe, hello. There's a button right here. That's the one. If you click that, it will blow up the map and make it full screen. And what this is a collection of text. Gary's written down just immense amounts of information in text on each of the different sites. And we've got the text, and he's collected pictures for most of them, all of them, I think. And they're in this Google map. Can you go back, please?
To the previous page.
Just go up here to this little arrow, upper left. So, not that you're going to learn everything about maps tonight, so there is a link at the top of this page that takes you to tips on how to move around, because there's a lot of different things you can do with Google Maps. So this has collections of schoolhouses. There's these 3 that are listed right here, plus 13 more. And then there's the Underhill Historical Society, so there's the 4 that are listed, plus 38 more, so 42 sites. And let's just take a quick look at one of them. So let's click on 38 more and go to Dr. Burdick. So when you click on a link in here, it highlights the place mark for that particular item. If you use this plus arrow down here, the zoom, and just click it once, twice, just keep going.
Wow.
And so you can move in and see and go a little bit further. So you can see where each different site is. On the left is text, and can you scroll to the bottom of the text? And then if there are pictures, there's a link down here. This says that there's 5 photos, so if you click on that, you can then use the arrow key to move from slide to slide, or there's a button over there. So there's pictures that go with each of the sites. And if you could go back and back again. You can also just simply click on a place mark, and that will bring the same thing up. So there's lots of ways to move around, but the idea is there's copies of the text that Gary labored over, and Jerry, and the pictures for those different items. Any questions? You can also move around the map. I'm not going to take the time to show you that, but you can just drag and move around the map.
If anybody has any questions about anything I talked about, you're welcome to chat or ask or whatever you'd like.
So 1938, why did the railroad go out of business?
Because there was no business. Basically, you think about in 1877, you wanted to go into Burlington. I mean, it's an all-day trip. Maybe you could take the stagecoach in, but that was about it, your choices. By 1938, you hopped in your automobile. You know, the railroad had been a great thing in the 1870s and 1880s, but in the 1930s, you know, 1935, even Route 15 was paved. You know, you weren't even going on a dirt road anymore. And you know, so you had no trouble getting around. You came and went on your own schedule. The train was on a fixed schedule and a fixed route. And it was just handier to go on your own like you would today, and not nearly as much traffic. Yeah.
In what year did the mass deforestation of the mountain begin, the logging operation, and what year did it end?
Well, I say the steam mill was built in 1876, and there was a 2 or 3 smaller sawmills up in Underhill Center and so on. But you think, I mean, if you're sawing a log up in Underhill Center, okay, once you got the lumber, what do you do with it? Where this one down here in Riverside, you know, you loaded it on the train and off it went. I mean, you had a much wider market, so that really is what opened it up. You know, there certainly had been logging done to some extent well before that, but this was what really opened up the market to the wider world. And it ended when it was logged off. I say the mill went out of business in the early 30s, and you know, by that point, you know, the whole side of the mountain pretty much had been logged off. So whatever you see today is what's grown back since then.
So the name Riverside and Underhill Flats, were they actually 2 different communities?
Well, yes, of course, because they're in 2 different towns. That's the thing. I mean, you know, in so many regards, I mean, just in general, you know, Jericho and Underhill are very much tied together. I mean, we're in the building that belongs to the Jericho Underhill Library District. I mean, but in particular, when the earliest settlement in Underhill was up on Poker Hill, you know, what you know of today as Poker Hill Road was the first road through the village, through the area. So, I mean, if you were traveling, you know, you came from Essex or Burlington or whatever, up through and up over the hill and came down into Cambridge. Well, as time went on, you know, the Crick Road was opened up, and you know, that became more of the thoroughfare, what today's Route 15. But when they first settled, they're settling up on Poker Hill because A, that's the main road, but B, it also, there was areas up there, what they called beaver meadows, which were large open areas, so that it wasn't like you're having to clear forest to create a farm. You know, you had some open land that was ready to go. And so then, as time went on, and you know, by the 1820s, 1830s, as more people are starting to move in and so forth, you know, they started settling down off the hill. Well, you think about around this general area, where's a good place to settle? Well, there's a big flat area there, and so that makes a good place to settle. The only thing about that big flat area is half of it's in Underhill and half of it's in Jericho. You know, the town line runs right through the middle of it. But you know, if you're settling there, I mean, you're just buying your own little piece of property to settle on, so it really didn't matter much. But the village grew up around this one village that, just by fortuitous circumstance, was in 2 towns. So the Jericho part of it is Riverside, the Underhill part of it is Underhill Flats.
So was the area up on Poker Hill Road referred to as Underhill Flats also?
No, that wasn't flat. No, really, I don't know if there was a name particularly for that. I mean, the only thing up anywhere near there, which it really isn't exactly there, is North Underhill. But that's more what you think of as like North Underhill Station Road and so on. But you know, it comes up onto the other end of where the settlement was. Jim?
Yeah, I'm just staggered by the number of times you said that buildings burned.
Well, you think about, well, like say with the GAR hall, you know, you've got this second floor assembly building, which you've got different meetings in there, big crowds, all kinds of activity going on. What if you're up there at a time like right now? Kerosene lights, and you know, if say it's a couple of months from now, wood or coal stove. I mean, you know, sometimes there was just a little oops, you know, like this in the August 1906 fire in the flats. an oil stove exploded. It turns out the woman was out sleeping in a hammock and the man was sleeping in the house, and some neighbor noticed the fire and went in and alerted him. The guy just barely got out and didn't have time to save his hat even. So, they were just weren't paying attention to the stove. Like today, if you walk out and leave your stove on. And just all kinds of little things like this, but there was relatively more things that might cause a fire than there are today.
Plus the buildings are all wooden.
Well, mostly. I mean, you had the brick store, and there was a few brick houses, but still, even a brick house could catch fire.
Was Ethlyn Foster related to the Fosters that you mentioned?
Oh, indeed. Jasper and Winifred, they were husband and wife, and then Jasper's sister was Grace. Well, Ethelyn was Jasper and Winifred's daughter. And they also had a son who lived down North Carolina or somewhere. But Ethelyn taught school in Underhill High School here for a while. That closed in 1947, I believe. And after that, she went to school, down in Essex, taught down there. She was a math teacher. And I went to Essex High School, and I rode to school back and forth with her for 4 years. No school buses in those days. No high school in the town.
So with all this activity in the flats, how did Underhill Center fit into the picture?
Well, there wasn't nearly so much going on, for several reasons. I mean, if you think of it, even today, I mean, Underhill Flats is on the main road going from Burlington to, Morrisville or whatever. And that was, I'll answer you a little more in particular, but one of the things it reminds me of is they're talking about the Bostwick House, and they talk about back in the mid-1800s, one of the things that would be the equivalent of a tractor-trailer truck today was a big covered wagon drawn with a team of 4, 6, 8 horses. And they would talk about, they would come into the Dixon House or the Bostwick House, whichever era, at dusk, and by 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, they're getting up and leaving again. And that was how what goods got transported. That's how they got transported. And so, say this was the main road that they're going on even back in that time period. So Underhill Center, whether you're talking about 1800 or 1900 or 2000, relatively speaking, it's off the beaten path. And so there was at least 2 or 3 churches up there. In fact, the what's now the United Church was the Congregational Church here in the Flats. That originated in a building up on Poker Hill, where this early settlement was. Then there was another one that was constructed partway, kind of they think around where the corner of River Road and English Settlement Road is, but they never really finished the building. And in, I don't know, 1840-ish or somewhere in there, the church in the Flats burned, and they picked that building up and moved it down to the Flats. And that one again burned in 1845, and the one that's there now was rebuilt in 1847. So, people would have been going to something like that. But beyond that, there wasn't the social organizations that there were in the Flats. And to say there wasn't relatively speaking, the traffic that there was in the Flats. And, it was relatively a little more of a population center and so forth. So if that kind of at least gives you a feel for how it worked. Yeah.
The B&L Railroad went to Cambridge Junction. Did it join another railroad?
Yes. The Portland and Ogdensburg. I think the Portland and Ogdensburg was a subset of some other railroad, I don't remember now. But the idea behind that was they were going to have a railroad that would go from Portland, Maine to Ogdensburg, New York. And this would be a through route that would allow a lot of business going from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. This was, of course, before the St. Lawrence Seaway and all of that sort of thing. Well, it kind of worked out, but it wasn't the greatest. Eventually that kind of got broken up, and the part through Vermont became the St. J and LC, the St. Johnsbury and Lake Champlain, or the slow jerky and late coming, depending on your point of view. And so the Burlington and Lamoille was a connection between, well, you had the Rutland Railroad that's coming into Burlington. You've got the Central Vermont that's coming into Essex Junction. And so it's a connection between Burlington through Essex. So it connects with both of those railroads. And then it goes up and connects at Cambridge Junction with the St. J and LC. Well, the B&L was only a independent railroad for maybe a couple years, and they were just financially in over their heads, and so the Central Vermont took them over, and for most of its existence it was run by the Central Vermont as a B&L subdivision.
How many years did it exist?
It opened in, I believe it was July of 1877, and it went out of, the last train was June 16th, 1938, so 61 years. So,
Can you squelch the rumor that there's a steam engine buried in the mud?
oh, certainly. I'd be happy to squelch that. No, I don't remember the exact date, 1904, 1906, somewhere around there, I think it was. In the, well, middle of the winter sometime, I don't remember, again, the exact date, the train had gone up through in the morning, and the day was sunny. It had warmed up enough so that, you know, the ice and snow had melted and so forth. Made it up through fine in the morning. Well, in the afternoon, they're coming back. Well, that time it's getting later in the day. It got cold enough so this water was starting to freeze, froze over a section of the tracks. What's the road up there? Duffy? Where, just this side of North Underhill Station Road, there's a side road up on the other side there. And it was about opposite that road. And the water had flooded over enough, it was high enough so it flooded over the tracks, then it had frozen. So when the train comes down through, the engine rides up onto this ice and slides off. And so, you know, they cleared the tracks and so forth and got things back in operation. But everything was, you know, the locomotive and so on were just left there. And it was the next summer, they went back in warmer weather, more conducive to doing this, and got the engine back out. And there's a really nice photograph of that, you know, the remnants of it after it was taken out. And I believe this is one of the Homer Holmes postcards, where he had written a little poem on the side of it. And this was, I can't remember the whole thing of it, but it's locomotive 328 that was going along. Colonel Knox was the boss of me at the time. He did everything, he tried everything to keep me in check, but nothing could keep me from having a wreck. And so they say they took the locomotive out, but the rumor, what you're trying to quelch here, nobody really seems to know, but the consensus seems to be that yes, they did take the locomotive out. They say there's a bunch of pictures of that and so forth, but that's all that they took out. They didn't take out the tender. So the tender may still be there. But, you know, I don't know that there's anybody that's ever proved that one way or the other.
Another question about the flats. Jacob's IGA, when I was a kid, Tippy had to sell the beer in the front of the store because Jericho was a dry town, and the front of the store was in Underhill. I assume that's why he closed in the porch. Maybe.
I don't believe so. I think there's enough of the store was in Underhill so he could still do that without the porch being closed in.
Oh, okay. But then somebody recently told me that Underhill and Jericho took turns going back and forth being dry and wet. I never heard that before.
Yeah. I have heard basically the story. I've never done the research as to which town voted which on what year and all that sort of stuff, but just heard the story that, you know, as things changed, they moved it from one end of the building to the other.
So did it go back and forth?
Yeah,
Somebody said they went back and forth. I don't know.
yeah, I'm sure there were times when one was wet and one was dry, and, you know, then the other times when they swapped, there very well could have been times that both of them were wet or both of them were dry. I've never done that particular research, but it. Yeah.
So, Gary, these hotels that cater to the horse and buggy coming in, did they have stables
Oh, yeah.
part of the hotel for the horses?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the beach house in Jericho had a big livery stable connected with it, and the Dixon house here in Underhill and Riverside and so on. And the Custer house, they talk about, they rebuilt the barn there, to make it more commodious and so on. Yeah, it was just what you did. I mean, as I say, you think about, how far can you travel in a day's time with a horse or horse and wagon? So you couldn't go 100 miles a day or something, so you needed hotels in pretty much every village along. So that was, and you needed, what good would the hotel do you if you couldn't accommodate your horse? So that was pretty much everybody did that. Yes.
Hi, I came a half an hour late, I'm so sorry. So I don't know if you had spoken about Underhill Center.
No.
Okay. We live in the kind of sage green farmhouse to the left of the town hall, 1840s circa. And then the dance hall across, the blue, kind of lighter blue color building is also ours, we rent that. And so
The hen house.
it was supposedly, we don't know very much about that area. We're so curious. I know Cedric used to milk the cows in the dairy barn that was on our property as a boy, he said. And then Guy Kennedy used to play in our house and said there was an old man that lived in the house and there were chamber pots and they blew up stuff in the driveway. And I don't know. But was the dance hall across the street, it was supposedly a chicken coop, because they used to call it the coop.
The hen house.
And a lot of people around here got married.
The hen house.
There, right? Many years ago, during those dances or something, right? So I just wanted to see if you could shed any more light on this.
Well, for one thing, first of all, I have to tell you, despite doing this, I actually live in Jericho. I went to the ID school, so I know about the flats. But Underhill Center, I mean, now I used to stand out in front of the ID school in the morning and see the Underhill Center school bus take the kids from up on Poker Hill by us and take them up to Underhill Center. So I never knew nearly as much about Underhill Center. I mean, when I was a kid, the hen house was still in operation, but I mean, I was certainly too young to be going to anything like that. So, other than knowing it was there, I don't really know much of anything about it. And, the village in general, I don't know a whole lot about. So I'm not a good one to answer your questions on that.
No worries, no
My
worries.
great-great-grandmother ran a hen house with her husband.
That one?
Yeah, when it was an actual hen house.
Uh-huh.
And the red house next to it used to,
The Osgood's house, the
yeah,
Red House.
that used to go with the hen house.
Really? Oh my. I wonder if the Osgoods know that. I'll have to hear more.
Well, thank you very much.